macular degeneration does not plunge you into darkness. It simply erases the center of the world. It begins as a smudge, a gray thumbprint precisely in the middle of your visual field. You can see the edges of a clock, but not the hands. You can see a person's hair and shoulders, but their face is an anonymous, foggy void. To navigate my own house, I had to look at everything sideways, relying entirely on my peripheral vision. The clinic offered an experimental synthetic retinal graft, a localized injection of biological nanostructures designed to rebuild the dead tissue of the macula. I signed the waivers without reading them. I just wanted the center of my life back. I removed the bandages alone in my living room, 2 days after the procedure. The heavy gauze fell away. I opened my eyes. The periphery of my living room was exceptionally bright and sharp, the edges of the sofa, the rectangular frame of the television, the leaves of the potted ficus. But the center was still gone. The gray thumbprint remained, a stubborn, floating eclipse hovering exactly where I focused my gaze. Heavy, crushing disappointment settled in my chest. I sat on the sofa, staring straight ahead at the blank wall, letting the gray void rest in the middle of my vision. Then, the gray began to curdle. It didn't fade. It shifted, twisting like a camera lens aggressively hunting for focus. The fog thinned, the gray particles separating to reveal a sudden, hyperrealistic clarity. But I was not looking at the wallpaper. Suspended in the absolute center of my vision was a perfectly crisp, circular window. Through it, I saw a floor of stained, wet concrete. I blinked rapidly, rubbing my eyelids. When I opened them, the circular window was still there. I turned my head to the left, looking toward the hallway. The window moved with my gaze, dragging the image of the concrete floor across the physical space of my house. It was an overlay, a localized aperture locked directly to the center of my retina. My peripheral vision showed my familiar home. My central vision showed a subterranean cell. I held my breath and forced my eyes to remain perfectly still. I focused deeply into the anomaly. The depth of field shifted. The concrete floor in the window tilted upward, revealing the rest of the room. It was a vast, subterranean chamber devoid of light sources, yet illuminated by a sick, pale luminescence. In the far corner of the chamber stood a figure. It was impossibly tall, its limbs stretched like pulled taffy. Its skin was translucent, stretched so tight over its skeletal frame that I could see the dark, sluggish movement of fluids beneath the surface. It had no face, only a smooth, concave depression where features should have been. It was facing the wall. A wave of deep, primal revulsion washed over me. I tried to look away, to cast my gaze to the floor, but the human eye is drawn to movement. The figure twitched. Its elongated spine arched violently. It began to turn around. The movement was disjointed, lacking the fluid grace of biology. It swiveled its featureless head toward me. Even without eyes, I felt the immediate, crushing weight of its attention. It was looking directly into the aperture. It was looking at my macula. The figure raised a hand. The arm possessed too many joints, bending in nauseating angles as it reached toward the boundary of the circular window. Its hand grew larger within my central vision, coming closer and closer to the lens. I wanted to close my eyes. I commanded my eyelids to shut. They refused. Complete, localized paralysis gripped my ocular muscles. I was locked in an unblinking stare. The pale, multi-jointed fingers reached the absolute edge of the window. A sudden, freezing pressure bloomed directly on the surface of my right eye. It was a distinct, tactile weight pressing against my cornea. The entity wasn't just reaching toward a camera, it was reaching through the optical bridge. The tip of its translucent finger breached the boundary. The freezing pressure intensified, pushing inward, bending the surface of my eye as the entity prepared to pull itself through the pupil. My body rebelled against the ocular paralysis. I couldn't command my eyelids to close, but I still had my arms. I threw my right hand upward, slamming my palm aggressively against my face, burying the eye in the dark, suffocating pressure of my own flesh. The connection severed. The freezing intrusion on my cornea vanished instantly, replaced by the hot, stinging ache of my palm pressing against my eyelashes. My chest heaved violently, my lungs pulling in frantic drafts of air. I kept my hand clamped over my face and sank to my knees on the living room rug.
I had to test the boundaries of this biological infection. I lowered my hand, strictly forcing my eyes to look at the extreme left edge of the room, the space where the floorboard met the wall. My peripheral vision functioned perfectly. The edges of the living room were clear, defined, and entirely empty. Slowly, terrified of my own anatomy, I let my focus drift toward the center of the wall. The aperture opened immediately. The subterranean concrete cell returned to the center of my sight, but the entity was no longer in the far corner. It was pressed completely against the lens. Its featureless concave face filled the entire circular frame, magnified and distorted like a specimen flattened under a microscope slide. It was hovering at the boundary, waiting for the optical bridge to stabilize. I ripped my focus away, snapping my gaze back to the baseboards. The aperture dissolved back into the harmless blur of my periphery. The rules of the graft were established. Direct focus gave the entity a physical pathway. I could not look directly at anything. I had to navigate my life exclusively through the distorted, unfocused margins of my vision. I needed to leave. I needed a hospital, a scalpel, a surgeon to physically carve this synthetic nightmare out of my retina. I stood up, keeping my chin tucked tightly to my collarbone and rolling my eyes upward and to the far right. The muscular strain on the optic nerve was nauseating. The world became a smeared, fisheye panorama of shapes and shadows. I navigated the hallway by trailing my fingertips along the drywall, feeling my way toward the bedroom where I kept my car keys. The temperature in the house began to plummet. A dry, static cold settled over my skin, pulling the heat from my blood. I reached the bedroom threshold. My peripheral vision registered a tall, rectangular shape mounted on the closet door, the full-length mirror. Instinct is a fatal biological flaw. The human brain is hardwired to identify anomalies and evaluate threats. My peripheral vision caught a visual discrepancy in the glass, and before my conscious mind could override the reflex, my eyes darted to the center of the mirror to focus. The circular window snapped open in the reflection. But it didn't show the subterranean cell. The aperture showed the physical space of my own bedroom, reflected in the silver backing of the glass. Standing directly behind me, visible only within the tight, gray boundary of that central focal point, was the entity. It had crossed the threshold, but it hadn't materialized in the open room. It had colonized the blind spot itself. It existed physically in my house, but visually, it remained perfectly hidden inside the ruined center of my vision. Through the aperture in the mirror, I watched its elongated, multi-jointed arms reach out. I watched the translucent fingers hover over my shoulders. Then I felt the freezing, physical pressure of those fingers settling heavily against the skin at the base of my neck. I was forced to make an impossible choice. If I looked away to break the visual bridge, I would be turning my back on a physical threat I could no longer track. But if I kept looking into the mirror to watch its movements, I was giving it the focused optical energy it needed to anchor itself completely into my reality. The fingers on my neck tightened, burning my skin with an unnatural frost. The entity leaned forward, its concave face moving closer to the back of my skull, waiting for me to decide. The freezing pressure on my neck deepened, a chemical frostbite that bypassed the skin and settled directly into the muscle fibers. The entity was anchoring itself, drawing physical density from my sustained focus. I made my choice. I squeezed my eyes shut with every ounce of strength I possessed, trying to crush the optic nerve under the weight of my own eyelids. I expected the connection to sever. I expected the physical weight to lift. It didn't. Total darkness did not follow. The synthetic graft did not require external light. It was wired directly into the visual cortex. In the pitch black of my closed eyelids, the circular aperture remained, burning like a phosphorescent brand against the inside of my skull. The optical bridge was independent of the physical eye. I couldn't look away because the window was inside my mind. The heavy, freezing grip on my neck released. The ambient temperature around my face dropped further. Then the tactile horror escalated. Long, multi-jointed fingers, radiating a dry ice cold, traced the outline of my jaw. They moved upward, resting against my cheeks. The thumbs hooked firmly under my brow bone, while the elongated index fingers anchored against my upper cheekbones. It was prying my eyes open. I fought the intrusion, squeezing my facial muscles into a rigid mask, but the physical strength of the entity was absolute. The cold, translucent fingertips dug into the delicate skin of my eyelids, forcing them apart. The harsh vanity lights of the bedroom flooded my vision, but the center was entirely consumed by the gray aperture. The entity's concave, featureless face filled the focal point completely. It was no longer observing me from a distance. It was leaning in. The smooth depression where its face should have been pressed directly against the surface of my cornea. There was a sickening tactile sensation of fluid merging, a freezing drop of liquid nitrogen sinking through my pupil, bypassing the lens and flooding the vitreous chamber of my eye. The cold tunneled straight back into my optic nerve. The entity wasn't just pulling itself into my bedroom, it was pushing itself into my biology. It was using the synthetic macula as a doorway, and a doorway only works if something steps out to make room for what steps in. The visual perspective violently inverted. It felt like being physically turned inside out. The pressure in my skull vanished, instantly replaced by an expansive, suffocating dampness. The harsh light of my bedroom vanished. My hands no longer felt the soft cotton of my shirt. They were pressed flat against wet, stained concrete. The air in my lungs was stale, heavy with the metallic taste of old soil. I pushed myself up onto my knees, my muscles aching with an alien, emaciated stiffness. I looked up. Above me, floating in the dark, subterranean air, was a perfect, glowing circular window. Through the aperture, I saw my own bedroom. I saw the edge of the mattress, the wooden frame of the mirror, and the back of my own body. The body that used to be mine slowly turned around to face the window. It wore my clothes, it possessed my posture, but as it leaned toward the lens, looking down into the subterranean cell, I saw the face. Where my eyes should have been, there was nothing but smooth, concave depressions of pale, unbroken flesh. It stared down at me through the focal point, a perfect imitation of life. It raised my hand, reaching out of the window's frame toward the bedroom wall. The visual feed from my house cut to absolute black, the aperture closed. The macula was cured, the window was shut, and I was left entirely alone, sitting on the concrete floor with perfect vision in the dark.